All right, so hi class. At this point, you have read the excerpt of Moby Dick. You've answered the four literary analysis questions looking at Ahab's blasphemy and why the crew would follow him and all of those things, and hopefully have listened to my video where I kind of gave you some of the background and interpretation that I've come to understand over the years that I've read it. So you are ready now to move on from that and into what is considered the really kind of the assignment for this, and that is a literary analysis paper. And what you're going to be doing is focusing on diction, imagery, and symbolism, and how those are revealed and connected to the power of darkness, which is one of the big ideas or the big concepts from the dark side of American Romanticism. So a literary analysis maybe sounds vague in the title, but really you're just analyzing literature. You're breaking it up into pieces and determining how do each of those pieces help the whole piece. So how do they create a whole meaning? And then you're going to argue for a particular way of understanding it. So you're analyzing kind of how well something's used to create a whole meaning. And for this analysis, like I said, you're focusing on just that portion where it starts with "it drew near the close of the day" on page 285, and it ends with "truth hath no confines." So it's only a couple of pages you're working with, but there's a lot of stuff in there. So if you look down here at the essay prompt that you're going to be reading, the essay prompt for the literary analysis is going to kind of answer a question in a way. Here's the big things. You need to make sure that you're addressing the prompt. Don't write around the prompt. Don't write things that don't necessarily deal with the prompt, but you're going to want to really make sure that you are hitting your thesis statement and that you are answering the question of how Ahab believes that Moby Dick is evil. How is it that Herman Melville shows us that? And you're going to use specific evidence in order to help support your answer, which means that you're going to actually draw pieces out or pull pieces out of the text and quote those, but you're going to seamlessly quote them and integrate them into your analysis of how Melville does that. Now, I want you to think carefully before you write and be sure that you are really, really following the prompt. So, if you look here at this sentence, it says, in a well-developed essay, show how Herman Melville uses diction, imagery, and symbolism to reveal why Captain Ahab, okay, not Melville, but Captain Ahab, regards the white whale Moby Dick as evil. Here's an idea to kind of start with. At one point on page 287, Ahab says this: "How can the prisoner reach outside except by thrusting through the wall? To me, the white whale is that wall shoved near to me." If you think about it, prisoners are held in prison. There are walls physically containing them so that they cannot escape, and they're doomed to live there for whatever their sentence is. But for Ahab, Moby Dick is that white wall. Now, is he physically trapped by Moby Dick at this point? No. There's been a physical alter to his body, but really the way that he's trapped and he becomes a prisoner is in his own mind. So Ahab is becoming this person who's completely obsessed and cannot move past what he considers to be a wall mentally, and that is Moby Dick. So let's get into what the essay is going to look like. First of all, you're going to have your introduction. Just like any other essay you've ever written, you're going to want to introduce the idea, but there are pretty specific guidelines for what this is going to look like. The first sentence of your introduction needs to include certain information. And in this essay, it's going to be the name of the author, which is Herman Melville, the name of the title, which is Moby Dick, and you're going to write that in italics and hyphenated. And then you're going to make a tie, or you're going to connect it back to American Romanticism. So here's what I'm going to say. Something along the lines of, in his novel Moby Dick, Herman Melville discusses or explores or hints at the dark side of American Romanticism, including the power of darkness and the insanity of people. Or you could say something like, in his novel, Moby Dick, Herman Melville looks at the dark side of American Romanticism, including aspects of insanity and evil. It's pretty simple because you're just giving me the same basic parts, but each one of you is probably going to choose a different aspect of American Romanticism that you feel is most reflected in this piece. So that's the first sentence. Then after this, you'll see that it says briefly summarize the novel's plot. You're going to tell me the who, the what, the when, and the where. I'm going to give you a hint. This should be no shorter than 2 sentences and really no longer than 3. So most of you are probably going to give me the basic plot points on what seemed like a routine whaling voyage. Captain Ahab takes his crew on a hunt for the whale he considers to be evil, Moby Dick. And while Captain Ahab is on this voyage, he becomes increasingly more disturbed, and it is revealed to the crew and the reader that he's actually obsessed to a point where he cannot move past this feeling of vengeance. And that pretty much summarizes it. You've told me who, you told me what they're doing and where they're going. And some of you are going to maybe want to include the fact that it was published in 1851, and others of you may mention the fact that it was a routine whaling voyage, but they were deceived, the crew was deceived. Everyone's going to have a little different take, and that's fine. I want you to personalize it in some ways. And then you're going to look and say that you're going to include your thesis statement. The thesis statement absolutely needs to be the very last sentence of your introduction. And it should be something like, in these 3 parts, Captain Ahab regards the white whale Moby Dick as evil, as revealed in the author's use of diction, imagery, and symbolism. You're really not going to change diction, imagery, and symbolism because those are the things that you need to focus on for this paper. You're really not going to change the fact that Captain Ahab regards the white whale Moby Dick as evil because that is the point you're trying to prove. You can choose to use some different adjectives or verbs or adverbs or whatever it is that you want to use to change up your sentence, but you're going to still hit on the point that it's Ahab believes that Moby Dick is evil, and it's shown through these different ways that the author included. So your thesis statement's pretty much set, with the exception of a few words being changed. Now, after you've done your introductory paragraph, you're going to want to go into paragraphs for the body. And there are 3 different paragraphs that you're going to use. The first one being diction, the second being imagery, and the third symbolism. Because if you look up here, the way they've introduced them is diction, imagery, and symbolism. Now, if you choose to change the order of these, you also need to change the order of the paragraphs. In each of these, you are describing how it is that Melville uses diction or imagery or symbolism to regard Ahab's belief that Moby Dick is evil. And you're using textual support to do that. So actual pieces from the text. We're going to talk a little bit more about this when we get to the second page. Now down at the bottom, your conclusion says that you'll restate in a slightly different way your thesis. So up here, if your thesis is, Captain Ahab regards the white whale Moby Dick as evil as revealed in the author's use of diction, imagery, and symbolism, you may choose to restate it slightly by saying, with the author's use of diction, imagery, and symbolism, Melville is able to show how Captain Ahab regards the white whale as evil. And so you've essentially used the same thesis, you've just swapped the way that you present it. You're going to summarize your main textual support, kind of just identifying what are the main points that you came up with, and then provide closure to your essay, which is just a final thought. Now here's where the work actually comes in for this particular assignment. I'm going to ask you to fill in this chart with examples of diction, imagery, and symbolism within the within the part of the graphic organizer. And you're going to also provide the page number it comes from and the character name. So for instance, in diction, you're going to look for words that have a strong connotative meaning. In particular, words that are going to evoke an emotional appeal. So there are several times when Captain Ahab refers to the whale with very strong language. At one point he calls him inscrutable, and he says that he has an inscrutable malice sinewing in him. And I believe that's on page 286 or 287. And this is used to say that Moby Dick is mysterious, and that his mystery is very evil, and that it's brewing and it's working and becoming bigger. That would be a good example of diction. So I would include inscrutable malice. I would include the page number, which is I think 287, and the fact that it was Captain Ahab who said it. An example of imagery might be where you include something about how the whale is described. So at one point they say he has a wrinkled brow and a crooked jaw. So you may choose to include that because it provides us a visual image. You may refer to the fact that Ahab calls out like a heart-stricken moose, which is going to give us a sound that we can associate with that. You may decide that there's a look in Ahab's face where he's wild-eyed and animalistic. Again, an image. And you just need to include the name of the person who said it, if it's a saying, or you need to say that the author is the one who said that. So obviously, if it's just a description, you would say, in the words of Melville, or according to Melville, or in this page, and you would talk about the fact that the author mentions what this person looks or sounds like. And then symbolism is typically the hardest one for students. I'm going to give you a few examples here. Think about the gold. And gold typically stands for something in literature, and oftentimes that's power or greed. Think about the fact that Ahab has grown increasingly more obsessive, and he's become crazed with the idea of catching Moby Dick. And most of you will probably associate that with insanity. He has some people who work against him, who call him blasphemous, and who call him out on his ridiculous notion that this whale is maliciously seeking him. And so you may say that that person or those people are sane, and so they represent sanity. And that would be people like Starbuck or Ishmael. But you do need to have quotes to back all these things up. So if you choose to talk about gold, you need to include the portion where it says it was a doubloon, it was a $16 gold piece. If you talk about Ahab's insanity, you need to use a quote from him where he talks and it sounds insane. Or if you choose to use sanity as it, then you need to talk about how Starbuck calls him out and says, listen, this is blasphemous. There's also the idea that Moby Dick is a white whale, which may indicate to some of you that he's innocent or that he's acting out of instinct, and so he's white on purpose. There are lots of different examples, but symbolism can be hard to find. So please, if those do not work for you or you're not interested in them, come see me and I can help you find some more symbolism in the piece. You're going to fill this chart out, find 3 to 5 examples. Ultimately, you're going to use 3 of them in your paper: 3 addiction, 3 imagery, and 3 symbolism. So a total of 9 pieces of textual evidence will be used in your literary analysis. After you've done that, this practice portion at the bottom helps put those phrases into syntactic structure or sentence structure. So for instance, I'll just look at at A. Captain Ahab's feelings of Moby Dick as evil are illustrated through the use of the word inscrutable from page 287. The author is attempting to describe just how mysterious Moby Dick is in the eyes of Captain Ahab. That's pretty much all you're doing, because when you're going back and describing this animal to the reader and how he is viewed by Captain Ahab, you're using the words that the author has provided and you're explaining how they relate back to the thesis. So this is going to be the big portion of planning for your literary analysis. I'm going to have you go ahead and turn these things in, because it is important to me that I see that you have done the pre-work before you start on your rough draft. And I'll kind of look through and tell you what I think about the particular pieces that you've chosen and give you some feedback on that. Let me know if you have any questions. Thanks.